Coming on the air because music legend Dolly Parton is dead at the age of 80. She was one of the most unifying forces in American culture, a celebrity for more than 50 years.
For decades, the world knew Dolly Parton as the woman who could turn a joke about her own wig into a headline, who could laugh about her figure before anyone else got the chance, and who somehow made rhinestones and big blonde hair feel like armor instead of costume. But behind that armor, in the final stretch of her long life, there were details she kept mostly to herself, things that only came into full view after her family finally released the truth about what she had actually been carrying. What emerged was far heavier than fans expected, and it changes the way many people will remember her final months. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, in a one-room cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains of Sauvie County, Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children raised by Robert Lee Parton and his wife, Aubrey Lee. There was no running water, no electricity, and very little money, but there was music constantly moving through that house, carried by her mother's voice and by the hymns sung in the small Pentecostal church nearby. Dolly began writing songs before she was old enough to understand what a career even was, and by the time she reached her teenage years, she had already performed on local radio and television in Knoxville and cut her first record. At 13, she stood on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, introduced by Johnny Cash himself, a moment that would have overwhelmed most children, but instead confirmed to Dolly exactly what she intended to do with her life. The day after her high school graduation in 1964, she boarded a bus to Nashville with almost nothing but ambition. The first person in her family ever to finish high school, and now the first to try her luck in the country music capital of the world. Nashville was not an easy place for a teenage girl from the mountains to break into. The industry at the time was run almost entirely by men who had firm ideas about how a young female singer should look and sound, and Dolly had to push against those expectations while still insisting on staying rooted in traditional country rather than chasing the pop crossover sound that was starting to dominate the charts. It was on that very same day she arrived, standing outside a laundromat, that she met a young man named Carl Dean, who worked in asphalt paving and had no interest whatsoever in show business. 2 years later, they married quietly in a small Baptist church in Georgia, partly because her record label worried that a public wedding might damage the image being built around her. What followed was one of the more unusual arrangements in celebrity history, a marriage that lasted close to 60 years, built almost entirely out of the public eye. Carl avoided cameras, avoided red carpets, and rarely appeared at the industry events surrounding his wife's career, running his own paving company, and living a life that had almost nothing to do with the entertainment world his wife was conquering. While Dolly's face became known across the planet, his stayed almost entirely anonymous, and many who knew the couple believed that separation of worlds is exactly what allowed the marriage to survive as long as it did. In 2016, they marked 50 years together by renewing their vows, a milestone that stood out in an industry where long marriages are rare. Professionally, the 1960s and 70s brought Dolly into a partnership with television host Porter Wagoner, whose show gave her the national exposure she needed to become more than a regional talent. She wrote constantly during this period, and in a single stretch in 1972 she produced 2 songs that would define her for the rest of her life, Jolene and I Will Always Love You. She has told slightly different versions of how those 2 songs came about over the years, sometimes suggesting they were written on the very same day, later softening that claim. But what never changed was how completely those 2 recordings captured something universal about longing and loss. By 1980, she had crossed into Hollywood, starring opposite Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin in 9 to 5, a film that became a massive commercial success and gave her another signature song. More film roles followed, along with a business empire that included the transformation of a small amusement park into Dollywood in 1986, bringing her name and her money directly back into the region that had once struggled to feed her family. Her philanthropic reach grew alongside her fame. In 1995, she launched the Imagination Library in her home county, a program inspired partly by her father's inability to read or write, something that had stayed with her long into adulthood. It began as a small local effort mailing free books to children and eventually expanded far beyond Tennessee into an international operation that, by the middle of this decade, had given away roughly 300 million books to children around the world. In 2020, she donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University to support vaccine research, a gift that later became one of the most publicly recognized examples of her wealth being redirected toward causes entirely separate from music or film. By that point in her life, the arc was almost too large to summarize in a single sentence. A child from a one-room cabin without electricity had built a career spanning music, television, film, tourism, and international charity, and the public mostly saw the shine of that success rather than what it had cost her to build it. What most of the public never saw clearly was how much pain sat underneath that decades-long climb. In the early 1980s, at what should have been the peak of her career, Dolly's body began to fail her. Severe abdominal problems and bleeding forced her to cancel performances, and in early 1982 she underwent emergency gynecological surgery, kept quiet from the press at the time. She was later diagnosed with endometriosis, a condition that eventually became severe enough to require a partial hysterectomy in 1985, when she was only 36 years old. That surgery permanently ended any chance of her carrying a child of her own, a loss that hit her extraordinarily hard given that she had grown up as one of 12 siblings and had always imagined motherhood as part of her future. She has since described falling into a depression during that period that she called one of the darkest stretches of her adult life, marked by dramatic swings in her weight and her emotional state. In a 2019 podcast, she admitted that at her lowest point she had thought about ending things, overwhelmed by grief over the children she would never have and by a body that no longer felt like her own, even as the public still expected her to show up glamorous and cheerful on television and in film. What eventually pulled her back, by her own account, was her faith, a connection to God that she described as deeply personal and constant during that recovery, something she leaned on again and again for the rest of her life. It was also during this era that she began deliberately reshaping how people talked about her appearance. Rather than let critics control the conversation about her wigs, her makeup, or her figure, she leaned into an exaggerated version of herself, coining the phrase backwards Barbie, and turning her look into something she owned rather than something done to her. It became one more example of a pattern that ran through her whole career, taking the things that could have been used to embarrass her, her poverty, her accent, her body, and converting them into parts of a brand she controlled completely. The next major blow came decades later. Carl Dean, her husband of nearly 60 years, had been ill for some time, and Dolly became deeply absorbed in caring for him during his decline. She has since admitted that while she focused everything on him, she almost entirely stopped paying attention to her own health. Carl died on March 3, 2025, in Nashville, at the age of 82. For a woman who had never known adulthood without him nearby, the loss was staggering. She dedicated a song, "If You Hadn't Been There," to him, and spoke afterward about how difficult it had become to write anything new, admitting that grief had, for the first time in her life, made it hard for her to turn pain into music the way she always had before. She talked about the anniversaries and holidays that followed as being particularly hard to get through, saying only her faith kept her steady, along with a belief that she would eventually see him again. Barely more than a year later, in July 2026, her older brother Dolly Parton died at 82 in Sevierville, Tennessee, remembered as a longtime crane operator and outdoorsman. It was one more loss stacked on top of the one still fresh from Carl's death, another reminder that the enormous family she had grown up inside of kept shrinking around her. Meanwhile, her own body was quietly breaking down. Reports throughout 2025 and into 2026 described recurring kidney stones and infections that left her immune and digestive systems compromised, problems she later said had thrown her entire body out of balance. Even so, she kept trying to work, reportedly staying involved in plans for a museum project, continuing to develop a Broadway musical based on her life, and exploring new performance technology that could let her music and likeness keep reaching audiences well into the future. That contradiction, a body demanding rest while her mind kept reaching for the next project, became one of the defining features of her last year, and friends close to her later said she simply was not built to sit still, even when illness gave her every reason to. She postponed a planned Las Vegas residency at Caesars Palace that had originally been set for December 2025, pushing it to September 2026, and then in May 2026 she canceled it outright, explaining that although medication and treatment were working, she was not yet strong enough for the physical demands of a live show. In October 2025, panic briefly spread online after her sister Frida asked fans to pray for her, sparking rumors that Dolly had already died, Dolly responded personally on video to reassure everyone she was still very much alive, joking about being the queen of social media rumors instead of tabloids. In early August 2026, she missed a scheduled Dollywood appearance, citing dizziness and dehydration and telling fans a doctor had clipped her wings. Days later, on August 21st, she gave what turned out to be her final public update, telling People magazine that she was dealing with health issues she had simply ignored while she was focused on caring for Carl, still framing herself as someone in recovery rather than someone near the end. Then, within days, everything shifted. She was admitted to a hospital in Nashville, and on August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton died at the age of 80. Her nephew Brian Seaver, who had served as a head of security, announced her passing on behalf of the Parton and Owens families, describing the moment as one carrying both pride and enormous sadness. Her representatives later confirmed that the cause of death was cancer, following what they described as a brief battle, though the specific type and details of her treatment were not made fully public. Reports indicated she passed peacefully at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center, surrounded by people she loved. The reaction afterward was immediate and enormous, spreading across country music, film, politics, and popular culture all at once. Fellow artists who had shared stages and studios with her spoke about her generosity and her humor, while institutions from the Hollywood Walk of Fame to her hometown of Sevierville became sites where fans gathered to leave flowers and notes. Her catalog, which included more than 3,000 songs and record sales exceeding 100 million copies worldwide, was only one measure of what she left behind. The deeper measure sat in things far harder to count, in the children who grew up receiving books through the Imagination Library, in listeners who found country music through her voice, in performers who watched her prove that a woman raised with nothing could move fluidly between music, film, and business without ever being boxed into just one of them. What her family's disclosures ultimately revealed was a life that looked, from a distance, like an unbroken rise from a mountain cabin to global fame, but up close was shaped just as much by loss. The children she never got to have, the depression she fought largely alone, the husband she cared for until his final days, the siblings she kept losing one by one, and the illness she quietly carried while still smiling for cameras and promising fans she would be back on stage soon. That gap between the image she projected and the reality she lived through is, in the end, what makes her final chapter so much harder to hear than anyone expected. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.